Hey everyone, Kelvin here. So in today's video, I've got a super easy and quick watercolor tutorial for you. And I'm going to show you how to paint this simple, colorful lotus flower. As usual, you can check the description below this video for a list of the brushes and textures that I'm using here. So these kind of flowers, we can do totally freehand. We don't need to do any kind of sketching first. For the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round brush. And this kind of medium pinkish red color. For the size, this is actually really important, and I want to show you something. If I use this brush at the largest size and do a kind of leaf shape, you can see there's not a lot of change in the opacity, but if I shrink that brush size, press a little bit harder, you can see it achieves a similar shape of stroke, but the smaller size is making the color get a little bit more exhausted first, and that gives me a nice fade throughout the stroke. Now, I think both of these types of strokes, they both look really good, but I prefer this one for the lotus flower, so I'm going to make sure I use the brush at a size that lets me get that kind of fade. And I'll start my lotus flower by painting 3 random petal shapes kind of clustered together like this. Now, these 3 petals are the ones that are facing us, and I need to obviously add a bunch more, but there's a problem I run into where if I just add more petals like this, you start getting this kind of overlapping onion skin effect, and I don't think that looks good for this flower. So to avoid that, I need to mask off these 3 petal shapes. So to do that, I'm going to grab the selection tool, set to freehand, and I'm going to try to trace around these 3 petals I've painted so far. And I'm doing it very, very roughly. Now, when I kind of reach back to the beginning of my selection, it's really important that I tap on that little gray circle to complete the selection. After that, I'm going to tap on invert. That's going to flip around my selection. Then if I use my brush again here, you can see it's allowing me to paint everywhere except on top of these 3 petals. So I'm going to go through and add a bunch more petals, making sure to leave a few kind of hanging off on the bottom. That gives the impression that the petals are very thin and transparent. Next, I want to enhance this layering effect by adding a little bit of shading, and I prefer to paint that on. So I'm going to select a slightly darker version of my kind of initial color, and I'm going to paint it just wherever I think there should be a little bit of a darker area on the flower. And right away, those are pretty rough. So I'm going to grab the water blender and use it at a small enough size that I can fit it in there and smooth out these transitions. And while I've still got the water blender selected, I'm going to use it to blend this kind of point where all the petals come together. Now the next part here is sort of optional, but I want to add a flower petal that's facing us. So for that, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, set it to the fine liner pen, and I'm going to carve out a sort of semicircle shape here. Then I'm going to go back to my abstract round brush, again use my kind of original pink color, smaller brush size, and I'm going to try to fill this in, but I'll leave a little bit of white showing through on the edge. And once the flower petals are finished, I'm going to start adding some interesting color variation. And to do that, I'm going to start by using the selection tool set to freehand, and the first kind of transition here is just at the heart of the flower. I'll feather out that selection quite a bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'm going to mess with the colors and try to find a desaturated green tone. There we go. Now, it's a personal preference of mine, but I like to add a kind of yellow shift pretty randomly throughout the flower. So I'll make a big random selection like that and feather it out. Again, hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll shift this towards yellow and maybe brighten it up a little bit. And these colors here are pretty normal, but if you want, you can do kind of further selections and color shifts and add some really unusual colors in there that make this flower stand out. Next, I'm going to start adding some details, starting with the stem. So I'm going to change my brush to the hard edge brush. For the color, I'll use a kind of medium desaturated, maybe a reddish green color like that. I think it's important to use a desaturated color for the stem, and I'll draw that one in. Next, I'm going to choose a slightly darker version of my stem color, and just paint it in up here And this is functioning a little bit like a shadow. Then I'm going to change to the water blender brush, and I'll use it to blend the stem into the base of the flower. After that, I'll change my brush to the fine liner pen, and I'll use a pretty bright yellow color, and I'm just going to dot this into a few spaces between the petals, maybe where we're seeing the kind of center of the flower showing through. Then after that, I'm going to make a blank layer above the flower. I'll use pure white, and I'm going to do a bunch of lines down the petals, but I won't do this on every single petal. And I did this on its own layer, so I can lower the opacity and set it to a point where it's just barely showing through. And there we go, just like that, this simple watercolor lotus flower is all done. If you like this tutorial and you think I've earned it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you're looking for another flower tutorial to try right now, I recommend watching one of these two videos next.